Good morning, everyone.
Hi. Okay. We have some serious issues with mic height here. So my name is Maren McRae, and
Yeah, I'm Warren Helgeson.
we're your Oscar hosts for the day.
Yeah. And anyway, we're happy to welcome you all here this morning. The first session is the Changing Agricultural Basins, and we have 5 panelists. But first, Maren and I are going to just give a quick synthesis and overview of some of the work that's related to agriculture that we did in Global Water Futures. And then we will have each of our panelists give a short presentation, and then we'll open it up for some discussion from the audience.
Great. Thanks, Warren. Okay, so I'm just going to kick it off by talking about the fact that we have a grand challenge in agriculture. We obviously need food. We need to support food security and economic security, but the fact is that this can have environmental consequences, and there's a lot of uncertainty with climate change. So we have this grand challenge of trying to support the security without, basically to minimize environmental degradation and respond to this change in climate. So this is something that we have all been working towards through this project. So if we look at some of the main GWF goals, sort of the very large, big picture goals, you can see they're listed on the screen, and I'm not going to read them through because you've seen them before, but essentially we're really trying to learn advance knowledge, advance the science, advance our ability to diagnose and predict futures, and development of models and other techniques. So when we try to translate these specifically to agriculture, these are some of the questions. And again, I'm not going to read every single one of those, but essentially you can get a feel for the types of things that are specifically adapted to agriculture that we were asking across the various projects that are tackling agriculture through the Global Water Futures program. So some of them, again, we're advancing knowledge surrounding process, spatial and temporal differences, climate drivers, landscape drivers, but the inclusion of socioeconomic information and the merger of this with some of the scientific data. We're also looking at advancing models, building new models, or adapting and improving existing models so that we can make predictions. And so when we look across the Global Water Futures projects, you can see that there are quite a few. Again, I'm not going to read them all off here, but you can get a feel for there are several projects that are actually tackling aspects of agriculture. And I'm going to try to just give you a very high-level overview of what some of the main takeaways from that work is. So I have this, I call this like my bingo card. But if we start to think about some of the questions that we were asking, just understanding what's going to happen with climate futures, trying to understand how this might impact crop success, water supply, water quality, and the socioeconomic drivers. And then if you look kind of across the top of my bingo card, you can see that there have been a large number of different approaches. So some of it was observatories, a lot of field observations and data collection, but there was also the development of innovative or novel techniques that might help us to further along our knowledge. There's also the development of models and toolkits. And then in some cases, it was actually a synthesis. It was a synthesis of what we know, where there is consensus. And so some of that took the form of multi-authored jointly published papers or workshops or whatever. But the fact is that no single project hit every single one of these, but across our projects, we have hit each and every one of these boxes. So I think that the GWF project on the whole has made substantial progress in understanding how agricultural futures and how climate change is going to impact agriculture in Canada. So what are some of the areas where we have, I tried to organize this into some thematic areas where across the projects we had made some progress. So one of such area is simply just improving our process understanding of how things work. What are some of the climate drivers? What are some of the landscape drivers? What about cycling, be that wet-dry cycles or freeze-thaw, precipitation characteristics? So there's been quite a bit of work done across the projects, and it's important that cold regions and cold processes, cold season processes were something they really used to represent a gap in our understanding. And so I think that we across the board have advanced that knowledge, but also advanced the fact that not all winters are equal. And a prairie winter is not the same as a Great Lakes winter, for example. So stemming from this, we also, I'm just trying to, oh, there it is. Okay, so another aspect that we really managed to tackle is understanding conservation practices or just management practices in general. Drainage, fertilizer management, cover crops and residues, soil fertility, stubble management. Basically trying to understand how our management of the landscape is going to affect water quantity and quality. And some of that was, of course, tackled across the projects in different ways, but we also had consensus, like special issues in journals to try to get global consensus on some of these processes. Wetlands are something that's been widely tackled, and so wetlands are coming up in different ways. So you can there's extensive wetland drainage in the prairies, but there are also smaller wetlands. You may have ephemeral wetlands or riparian wetlands or constructed wetlands, and these were all where constructed wetlands, for example, might be being employed to treat agricultural runoff. And so there's been a lot of work on tackling and understanding the importance of wetlands and their management in agriculture. Socioeconomic drivers as well, so things like incentives or how to engage with stakeholders or building toolkits for communication with stakeholders back and forth for optimizing decision-making and choice. And so again, I'm not going to dwell on this heavily because Roy Brower is going to talk a little bit about this today in our session, but these are some of the things that, again, across the projects is being addressed. Legacies are another one. So when we start to think about farmer behavior and how we're managing the landscape, if you change what you do, is it going to have an effect? Well, some work was done where we looked at soil fertility in phosphorus-rich landscapes in the prairies, and they found that indeed if there was a drawdown of that soil phosphorus, it could in fact have an impact on nutrients in runoff and phosphorus in runoff. But at the same time, we know that there's just so much of this stuff in the landscape. How do we manage those legacies? How can we understand when our actions are actually going to translate to a change in the systems? And so there's been a lot of work, again, that's been done on that. And again, I'm not going to dwell on the specifics of it because I know there's a lightning talk on some of this. So freshwater systems are another theme that's been tackled, and again, there's an entire session on that after lunch today, so again, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but as a central theme, looking at how our freshwater systems are going to respond to these agricultural stressors are also something that, and also just how we can detect these responses. These are all things that have been addressed. And now I'm going to pass over to Warren for some of his stuff.
Thank you, Maren. And based on some of the understandings that Maren was just talking about, a lot of our researchers came up with really clever ways of classifying parts of the study area. So recognizing that, well, even the prairies aren't the same everywhere, and Southern Ontario is not the same everywhere, and they're sure different from each other. We really needed some clever ways to contextualize the information that was being developed. And this provides an opportunity to target management practices. So for example, something like cover cropping may make sense in one region, but it certainly doesn't make sense in another region. And so there's a number of classification systems that were developed to help really target these BMPs and things to the appropriate audiences. And here's a slide after my own heart, observations. So one of the legacies of projects such as Global Water Futures are these extensive data sets that have been created. So this slide shows some eddy covariance studies that were done to monitor crop water use. So over Global Water Futures, we amassed something like 20 site years of crop water use data where there were none before, and that's spanning Saskatchewan and Southern Ontario. And from that comes new insight. So being able to observe things with instrumentation that wasn't possible before, we do develop new insights on how crops are using water, and that gives us the foundations for which we can infer things about how management practices and how cropping practices are going to have to change in the future to adapt to a changing climate. And from those understandings, then we can start to incorporate that into models, and that's exactly what's been happening. So, for example, on this slide here, there's an example here where of a researcher taking that observational data set and incorporating it crop models into a land surface model. There's CRAM, which is coupling the cold regions hydrological model with a crop growth model. And then some water quality models that are implemented within hydrology models. So really these are fresh ways of looking at problems and are really made possible by having these made in Canada data sets to develop these made in Canada models. And finally, we did look to the future. So we had some really excellent modeling runs that could inform us about what future climates look like, and then to see how the ag environment might change. So looking at things like how the agroclimatic indices have changed, such as things like observing a longer growing season, so less or more frost-free days, but then also, so those things that might look like they're better for agriculture, but then realizing that there's extreme temperatures and heat waves that probably will limit agricultural production. But these things, combined with the previously mentioned models, really give us the toolkit that we need to start to ask and answer some of these difficult questions for the future. So just to summarize or to synthesize some of the information that Global Water Futures with respect to agriculture has come up with. So we do have new insights into water use efficiency of crops and the soil-water-atmosphere relations, which will help to inform future crop choices and mitigate risk. We have new made in Canada representation of the biogeochemical processes and models which can help target BMPs that are appropriate. And we have new knowledge into incentives that are needed to actually make changes. And these insights help us to significantly advance the development and recommendations of place-based, so location-based, important targeted measures for producers to consider. And they all help us with representing these in not only physically based, but also socioeconomic models, which will help us understand the barriers to adoption. And I'll pass it back to Marion to close up.
Thanks, Wayne. Great. Okay, so I just wanted to make a comment about knowledge mobilization with regards to some of the work that Global Water Futures has done with regards to agricultural knowledge. And again, we have Nancy Gaucher who's also going to say some words. But I think what a big part of what we have done across our projects is we've co-produced knowledge with our landowners, managers, knowledge users, stakeholders, and that I think has really significantly advanced and improved certainly what's been done and hopefully how that's going to be used moving forward. And so again, and I think that just the variety of different ways that we've actually translated knowledge and worked with people and met with people to have these ongoing conversations, I've just sort of got a list here of some of the ways that we've done it. But essentially there have been everything from workshops, panels, discussions like we have today, but there's a lot of media, podcasts, fact sheets and blogs, and these are all things that are legacies from these projects that are going to be ongoing and probably adapted over time as new knowledge is gained in future. And of course, Twitter is, and Philip here is probably one of our most active agriculture Twitter users on the project. So we're excited to hear from him today as well. So I would like at this point to move on to our panel. So with the panel, what we did is we invited a range of people here that are working in our projects because they each come with a different, they're all coming with a different perspective. So I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Jane Elliott, who is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada and also the University of Saskatchewan. And Jane is everybody. I think we all know Jane as an expert in water quality and agricultural processes in cold regions, and I think she can speak to us as with regards to some of her experiences with the project, but also as a representative of ECCC, who is going to use some of our data and how that worked. So thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Maren. When Maren and Warren first asked me to talk today, they suggested I talk about my different roles in the project, the two different hats that I wear. I thought they were referring to my two lives, one as a researcher and one as a farmer. But apparently they wanted me to talk about my roles at Environment Canada, so doing scientific research and feeding into policy. I'm going to try and touch on all three today. My research deals with understanding the drivers of water quality in agricultural lands, with the goal of relating this work to agricultural management practices that will protect our water resources. This feeds into Environment and Climate Change Canada policy, and also into Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada policy. These departments are working together to try to find solutions for impacted waters, including Lake Winnipeg and the Great Lakes. These are kind of considered as endpoints for the Great Lakes for Eastern Canada and Lake Winnipeg for the prairies. From a policy perspective, the goals are to target areas where more research is required and places where management changes can have the biggest impact. The targeting occurs on many levels: where in the country, where in the region, and even where in the field. Which practice should be targeted where? This also leads to the importance of place-based solutions that can only be realized through understanding nutrient release and transport processes. Through Global Water Futures, we've drilled down into the drivers of runoff water quality to begin to understand which practice works where and why. We've documented why place-based solutions are needed, and we've demonstrated that you can't just take a management practice that has been proven successful in one region and take it and expect it to work in another region. Even within a region or field, parts of the landscape may need different treatment than the rest. As an example, we compared runoff from Manitoba and Ontario. Both are considered to be cold regions where most annual runoff results from winter snowmelt. However, they're very different. This slide shows the typical amounts of different forms of phosphorus transported during snowmelt and rainfall runoff on rolling and clay sites that we monitored in Ontario and the prairies through Agwater Futures. Snowmelt, the blue tones, dominates in both regions, but in Ontario, particulate P, the darker colors, is the main form transported, even during snowmelt, while in the prairie, the majority of the losses are dissolved. That's the lighter colors. Landscape drivers do play a bit of a role, with more erosion occurring in the rolling landscapes, but climate is the main source of the difference. In simplistic terms, the prairies are colder and soils freeze longer and more deeply. Runoff in Ontario continues throughout the winter, while in the prairie, snow tends to accumulate through the winter, often melting in a single event in early spring. Identifying these differences allows us to understand why processes are not transferable. Take cover crops and riparian buffers as an example. In Ontario, there's been great success using cover crops to reduce erosion, and both cover crops and riparian buffers prevent phosphorus from reaching water bodies, resulting in less phosphorus transport. The vegetation acts to stabilize the soil, and while it's actually actively growing, it can even take up dissolved nutrients, reducing their concentration in runoff. The success of these vegetative practices in protecting water quality on the prairies is not so apparent. Particulates are not a major source of phosphorus transported there, so the erosion reduction benefit is not important. And therefore, it is only useful in locations where erosion has specifically been identified as an issue. In other locations, the vegetation does very little to intercept the dissolved phosphorus, as it is dormant during snowmelt, and it may even actually contribute to nutrient transport. If the vegetation was actively growing in the fall, the extremely cold winter temperatures experienced on the prairies can release these nutrients that are then transported in runoff. This effect is not seen in Ontario, where the winters are much milder. The final challenge that I'd like to address is mobilizing our knowledge to the farmers who actually make the management decisions on the field. Practitioners who advise producers include some provincial personnel, some university extension specialists, and some independent agronomists. But increasingly, producers are being advised by agricultural retailers, and it's therefore extremely important that we reach the agribusiness sector with solutions that make sense, both environmentally and economically. As a first step towards this, we hosted a Keeping Phosphorus on the Land workshop to understand issues and opportunities for managing soil phosphorus, and to look for solutions that will improve water quality and maintain productivity. And that's our ultimate goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So I should mention that we gave each of our panelists sort of some questions for them to consider when they prepared their slides. And so the talks are kind of related to that. We won't necessarily announce what the questions are unless they decide to do that themselves. But that's the guidance that we gave them. And then we will open it up once all 5 of our panelists have given their short talks. Then we'll open it up to you for some questions, so you can think of some doozies. Our next speaker is Colin Whitfield. Colin is an assistant professor in the School of Environmental Sustainability here at the University of Saskatchewan. And Colin is one of the co-leads for the Prairie Water Project. And of course, the Prairies has a lot of agriculture, so we thought it would be great to get Colin up here to just share a little bit about his perspectives on how agriculture has factored into the Prairie Water Project and how we work together. So thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Warren and Marin, for the opportunity to join the panel this morning. I will share the questions with you guys that I've been thinking about since I got the invitation. So the first question I was asked was, what key questions did we tackle and how did we approach this? I'll try to give the short answer to this question because I probably could talk for my entire time just about this alone. We have a large and diverse team as part of Prairie Water. And if you're familiar with water security in Canada, you know that this is a region that perhaps is the most water insecure in the country. It's a region of extremes, and adaptation is part of the culture. And so we wanted to understand the practices that are driving change or perhaps risk to water resources. And we want to understand how those actions of today might affect water resources into the future, and also how the governance of those actions can impact water-related risks. So that's kind of the bigger picture, but we have teams looking at water cycles and how they respond to future conditions of climate and land use, thinking about the spatial distribution of groundwater resources and whether there are opportunities to potentially switch from surface water to groundwater for various uses, thinking about the role of wetlands, wetland function and management, and how various factors like land use, climate change, socioeconomics potentially drive that. And we started thinking about which wetlands should we keep, and I think ultimately we got to perhaps a shift in that question to think about which wetlands can we afford to lose. And we also have been thinking about what informs water decisions. So how does the information, particularly science, get used? How does this vary across users? And try and understand the decision-making process and how we might better position ourselves to engage in that. I think we're an example of transdisciplinary research. We've had a really engaged group of partner organization, about 36. It's grown over the course of the project, and they've been really instrumental in helping us to formulate the questions that we were tackling at the beginning, but also checking in and giving us guidance along the way. And we have a scientific advisory panel as well that's been really key to our knowledge mobilization efforts. I think throughout, we've kind of framed our research in this triple loop learning approach. So starting out by asking the question of, are we doing the right things? So that our user community was really instrumental there. Are we doing things right? So this is where we check in, we bring tools, and we've held a number of workshops and expo type activities to share what we're doing, get feedback, help us to improve it and refine it. And then perhaps we're at this last part, or approaching the last part. Graham Strickert always says, yeah, this is the really hard one. And I think that's very true. How do we decide what is right? And I think that goes beyond what we're doing and needs to involve much broader conversations. The second question, is agriculture a regional topic, or can we look at it on a national level? And I think broadly, it's a national issue. But as you've already heard from some of the comments from Warren and Jane, I think we need to think about regional drivers and regional solutions. So part of our approach has been to take a regional approach to water resources on the prairies and try to understand how different parts of the prairies respond to different stressors, climate, land use being major ones there. And we have some interesting results that show that space is really, really key, even within a region like the prairies. And that, of course, is going to differ when we get to southern Ontario or perhaps parts of British Columbia or maybe on the East Coast, where agricultural practices are different, the influences are different, the stressors are maybe a little bit different. Here's some work from some of our economics researchers, and this is just showing the land use opportunity cost, if you will, of keeping wetlands on the landscape. So we can see that there are a very, very wide range in cost of keeping those wetlands for producers. And probably what's happening here is that those that are the highest value are also, or have the highest opportunity cost to keep, are the ones that provide the greatest benefit to society as a whole. So we have some tricky, a tricky way to navigate this in order to preserve the ecosystem functions on the landscape, but also support the producers and help them to ensure their livelihood and address the questions that Maren started talking about off the top. The third question I was asked was, what aspects of agriculture do I think are a bit unique to the prairies? I might not fit into broader generalizations regarding agricultural water management. And I wrestled with this one a lot. I think there's a lot that's unique about the prairies, and so this is the list that I came up with. Unlike many of the more moderate climates where we have large agricultural activities in the country, the prairies are subject to incredible extremes, and we often have too much water or too little water, and very rarely the right amount, which poses incredible challenges for our producers. The water budgets are quite unique in that the landscape is not connected. A lot of the water goes back to the atmosphere. Very small amounts go to shallow groundwater recharge. And perhaps there's a shift in the future where irrigation will become a larger component of what happens in the region. Just thinking about the aspects of farming and farm practices in the prairies, we're 5 to 10 times typically larger in terms of farm size. So I think that influences community structure, the practices, the industry as a whole. And one of the really interesting things that was said to me when we were back near the start of this project was just about how efficient producers in the prairies are. And what that can sometimes mean is that when they take on a new crop, they do such a wonderful job of producing large amounts that it has important influences on the market, and it can drive prices down when there's a large shift to doing something new. And so the extent of that is felt not just within the region, but perhaps globally, and so that's important. And finally, I'll end by saying I think the norms are different here. The norms are different in the prairie region, and this is on a number of different levels. One is thinking about what might be okay to employ as an agricultural practice, and I don't think the things that happen here in the prairies would necessarily be acceptable everywhere, including the large amount of wetland drainage that's ongoing. And the other is that we have a really nutrient-rich landscape with somewhat green lakes historically. And so unlike some other regions where there might be a stronger a feeling when we start to manipulate water quality, I feel like the norms are a little bit different here, and we're accustomed to having green lakes. And so if we make them a little bit more green, that's maybe not as much of a concern as it is in other parts of the country. And so those norms, I think, are important in thinking through as we try to use our science and work with producers in the agricultural community in particular to address some of the water security challenges in the region and beyond.
Thank you, Colin. Our next speaker is Philip Harder. Philip got his PhD here in 2018 from the University of Saskatchewan. And so he's been employed as a postdoctoral fellow and now as a research associate with the Global Water Futures program ever since. And we're really lucky to have Philip for his sort of local knowledge and his hard work and his sort of unique approach. In fact, you'll see a lot of his work smattered around different Global Water Futures projects. But we've asked Philip just to come and reflect a bit on what it's like to have been sort of one of the HQP that have come through the Global Water Futures program and where that positions him now. Philip.
All right, thanks for the invitation. It's kind of a different ask of reflect on things, and so I can do whatever I want now. But yeah, so I was asked to talk about what it was like to be an HQP and sort of the opportunities and benefits and how GWF kind of plays a role into it. And so I think I just want to start off with kind of two pictures that kind of encapsulates, I think, a bit of the perspective that I've gained. And so I worked a lot on agricultural water interactions, and so on the prairies. And so when you look on the prairies, we often have this very pretty picture of, there's a wetlands. We still have some water in there. It's dry now. But you have nice fields and nice gridded mosaic and pretty clouds. And so this is kind of the drive-by. You look out the window, you see nice things, and when we do a lot of science, sometimes we only are afforded the opportunity to do a drive-by. But sometimes you can shift perspective. So this is taken on the same day. So one's looking out on an oblique angle over the landscape, we see a beautiful mosaic. Or you can look down. And this is in July 2021. We had a very intense heat dome, and I'm gonna just guesstimate and say that 50% of our crop in that field has had severe thermal damage and is not doing anything. So this is kind of an analogy for GWF in that we had the time, we had the resources where we could shift our perspectives. We could look down and see what was actually happening in a bit more of a way that we couldn't do things otherwise. So a little bit more specific to my interests is Canadian prairie agriculture and water interactions. And the one thing that I like to sometimes communicate is that, as Warren and others have alluded to, the prairies are not a uniform area. And we often talk about the prairies as being water limited. And for sure, there are places that are like that. So this is looking at spring wheat anomalies in bushels per acre for different parts of the prairies on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we've got precipitation in our agricultural year. And so clearly there's a lot of scatter in that relationship. And if you draw approximate lines through it, we can start to see some patterns. And so, Medicine Hat, it's the heart of the Palliser Triangle, is clearly a water-limited location. If we have more rain, we have more snowfall, we have more production. In the flip side, we have Winnipeg. And so, yes, there's clearly times when it is water limited and we have an increase in yields with precipitation. But on the flip side of that, as we get up into those more extreme precipitation values, we see decreases. And so there's a lot of dynamics in this area. There's a lot of extremes, as Colin alluded to. And so when we look at this, we can be a little bit discouraged if we want to. But when I look at this, I see the opportunity to, we're always going to have extremes. How do we shrink that anomaly? How do we reduce that y-axis? And the thing with GWF is that it really afforded myself the opportunity to try and tackle these questions. I guess I'm the perfect example because I started off as a grad student, did my postdoc, and then doing a research associate so I can speak to all those different things. But at the end of the day, we had long-term, stable environment for people like myself, and there are others, to really tackle some of these questions. On the prairies, we have a lot of different agricultural practices. I throw this picture up because this is what you see right now on the landscape. And so every spring, farmers go onto the landscape and they till, and they seed. Less tillage than there used to be is another aspect of this. And we have very low disturbance type farming. We only want to disturb the soil once for the most part. But when we're going out there and we're doing this very agronomic practice, are there opportunities that we have in that moment to do agricultural water management? Often we talk about agricultural water management in terms of irrigation or drainage, but anytime a farmer goes onto the landscape and they modify the surface in any sort of way, it is agricultural water management. We're changing how water interacts with our soils. We change what water is being used through our plants. We're changing bare soil evaporation. We're changing snow trapping. So one of the main highlights of my work was trying to say, look at this landscape, look at this system, and say, what can we do, and how can we manipulate our prairie climate, our precipitation, our inputs? What can we do to change the channel from we are victims of the precipitation to we have some ability to manage it? And so a big part of my work was trying to couple these things together. And so this is, taking legacies of cold regions hydrology on the prairies that have come through various streams at the U of S over time, and then, let's actually put this in with a crop growth model. And at the end of the day, we can start answering questions like, if we change how we manage our residues, how much surface crop residue do we leave on the landscape? So this is this residue scenario from base of nothing's happening to let's increase the amount of residue on the landscape. What about if we increase the stubble heights on our landscape? That increases the amount of snow trapping, reduces sublimation, we have more snow melt in the springtime. And what if we do both? And so one of the main aspects is that individually, we always knew each of these components, these processes on their own. But we haven't really integrated these things before. So the thing with GWF is we had the space, we had the time, resources, and the different groups that we could start finding these intersections. And so now we have this model. Obviously, all models are wrong, but we can link these processes in a chain to answer questions that matter. Yeah. And the other aspect of GWF is this intersectionality. So I wore a couple hats, and one being with Ag Water Futures, and the other aspect I did work with the Transformative Sensors, Technology Sensors Water, TTSW, so many acronyms. But so I did a lot of drone remote sensing. So we have our drone remote sensing on one side of things, we have agricultural water futures, and we can start bringing these, can we apply new systems, new technologies with our agricultural knowledge, our hydrology knowledge, in this case, to start manipulating or to start estimating crop evapotranspiration on a spatially distributed landscape. So, in this case, taking different perspectives. Let's use our plants to tell us what's happening in our soils versus let's try and put instruments everywhere. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it's this great opportunity, and the one aspect is we could push forward on the science, but at the same time, we could relate. An aspect that I found useful was to get outside the ivory tower and start talking to people and learning how the impacts of what we're doing relate, and also learning from them as well in return. So.
Thanks very much. And actually, it's a perfect segue into our next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Nancy Gaucher, who is a knowledge mobilization specialist and also with the Water Institute. So we asked Nancy a little bit for some of her perspectives around knowledge mobilization and policy and translating what we've done into action. So thank you.
Thanks, Maren. Thanks, Warren, for inviting me. So when I was asked to do this, one of the first things is I asked some of our partners that we work with what they thought were some of the major outcomes. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a good news story, because I think what we're doing here is having a research impact. Our agricultural research, if you look at it from a big picture perspective, there's a lot of good news stories that are happening. Think about it in terms of not just GWF, but I think GWF kind of sped things up. It was a catalyst for a lot of this. But over the last decade or two, a lot of things have changed. A lot of government cost share programs are changing the way that they're thinking about doling out the dollars to the agricultural producers. We've really changed our thinking around total phosphorus to be recognizing the importance of dissolved reactive phosphorus, and you're starting to see that in your policies and programs. Wetlands is another great example. It is a difficult situation, and we're still seeing the drainage of wetlands because of how politically complicated the issue is. But in government, the staff and the scientists are recognizing the importance of wetlands across the landscape and are looking for solutions, and I think that is a really important step forward. Likewise, we've heard a lot of people talk about the regionalization of best management practices. So there's a recognition that it's not just a one-size-fits-all, and Maren's research paper got a lot of traction, I think, for some of those messages. A lot of people found that to make a lot of sense, and we're seeing that across Canada, where your cost share programs are starting to think about which best management practices need to be placed in which parts of the landscape in order to be most effective. So this research is starting to filter down, and it's starting to have an impact, and it's not just having an impact on policies alone, but on the programs themselves. Another really important program that's happened sort of relatively recently is under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, you have RELP, the Resilience Agricultural Landscape Program. That included, I think, $250 million across Canada, and that program is starting to reflect some of the research findings that we have as it's currently being designed. So in Ontario, maybe other places are a little bit ahead. I think Ontario, they're still trying to figure out how that program is going to be implemented. So they're looking to GWF research to find out what parts of it can be implemented into the program. You know, I think when we think about knowledge mobilization, it doesn't always happen in a really direct way. It's not like science is here and then the program is here and then it influences it. It takes a little bit more time. And so we're starting to see some of this happen. And along with that, my second kind of key message is that knowledge mobilization is a really big part of that. Maren talked about some of the materials that they're developing. These are really important. The plain language explanations of what the research means, that is really critical in helping policymakers, helping the government scientists develop or articulate the science behind the recommendations that they're making in their policy briefs. So they're not doing it in exactly the same terminology that we are using, but that is being translated, and that plain language material is really helpful. The fact that we're doing so much work to disseminate our findings so widely is really important. Maren and other researchers are out there all of the time talking to farmers, tweeting to them, having the workshops. And that's really critical because not only is it a dissemination of findings, but it's also about building trust. And you're building trust with the people who you're trying to influence. That matters. That means they're going to listen, try to understand, try to figure out what it means for them. They're going to believe you when you are talking about what you're saying. Another really big part of knowledge mobilization is, and I don't need to tell this group, but involving partners in the development of the research. And that is a critical process because when they understand how their research is happening, they trust it more. And they build those relationships, like I said, with the researchers. Another really big point that I wanted to make is let's not forget about the role of our students. So our students are having a really big impact. And now after 7 years almost of GWF, they're graduating, they're moving into these roles. I come from Ontario, so my perspective is there, but a lot of the students that Maren has trained are now working in the government ministries. They're in our conservation authorities. They're working for our agricultural outreach organizations. That is a very clear path from academia knowledge into practice. And so, you know, one example, Kristen Grant, she was in Maren's lab, then she worked for Lake Futures as the project manager. She took all of that knowledge and all of that experience that she had developed through GWF and is now applying it to Alice, which is a great project that tries to work directly with farmers to implement best management practices. So yes, GWF is making really great contributions through our students themselves. Let's not forget that they're really key roles in that. They are their own knowledge management, knowledge mobilization pathways. And finally, I think we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep working with our industry. Maren started this by saying there's grand challenges. Agriculture needs to learn how to adapt to climate change, and this needs to happen through knowledge mobilization, through working with our partners and understanding what incentivizes them to move from research and findings and understanding to actually changing things on the ground. So I'll end there. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks very much. And I would like to introduce our final speaker, Roy Brower from the Department of Economics and the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the socioeconomic drivers associated with agriculture and across Canada. And Roy's done a lot of work in this area. So thank you very much, Roy.
Thank you, Maren. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the socioeconomic aspect. But before I start talking about the things that I want to talk about here, I'm going to talk or refer very briefly to what I'm not going to talk about, and that is the opportunity that Global Water Futures gave us over the past 6 years or so to develop a new generation of integrated hydroeconomic models at river basin scales across Canada. So we worked very closely together with the University of Saskatchewan, Leila Eamon, who can unfortunately not be here, George Garcia in the University of Waterloo, developed fantastic new models that integrated, connected, coupled economic data with hydrological and substance flow data and information that we had available. And those models have been used to look at the impacts of climate change, for example, on water availability here in the prairies, and how these impacts of water availability affect our economy in these basins, and gave us an idea of what the economic impacts are of water security, food security, and energy security. And so these hydroeconomic models have been very instrumental, in my opinion, in informing policy and decision making about what it means if we deal with climate change, what it means if we want to expand our irrigation capacity, for example, here in the prairies, for the economy as a whole. What happens in agriculture doesn't stay in agriculture. That's a very important take-home message, perhaps, for non-economists. Primary agricultural production is part of a food supply system, and what you do in primary production affects the entire food supply chain, as you probably have noticed during the pandemic, and that interconnectivity of the agricultural sector with all these other economic sectors in our economy is crucial to understand what the spillover or multiplier effects are of our interventions, willingly or unwillingly, maybe due to climate change, on our economy. So what am I going to talk about here today is economic optimization and behavioral change. And here I have a slightly less positive message, to be honest with you. Coming here to Canada 6-7 years ago, there is very little consideration of economic principles, economic methods, economic analytical tools in our policy and decision making when it comes, for example, to the selection of best management practices. And we know, or we have a lot of data and information about how effective these best management practices are, but we want to make sure that farmers choose those best management practices that are also most cost effective. They may be inclined to choose the cheaper BMPs that are perhaps less effective than the more expensive one that can be very effective. So that's what a lot of the work has focused on in especially in the Great Lakes Basin, where we looked at how we can better economically optimize and spatially optimize the available best management practices from which farmers are able to choose. And some of that work has been reflected in the paper by McRae et al. That was referred to already before. These costs, especially these economic costs of these BMPs, affect farmer choices. Something that I probably don't need to tell you. And behavioral change is something that we hardly look at either. So we do have cost sharing mechanisms, but it's cost sharing, and there's very little incentive coming out of these cost sharing programs, in my opinion, for farmers to actually take them up. And we see that the evidence is not that positive in Ontario, for example, when it comes to the uptake of these BMPs. And we've been doing this for 3 decades now. So I honestly think that there is a time, or a time has come, to revisit and reconsider how are we going to work with farmers and convince them to take up these BMPs. So I'm just going to show you some examples. I got 10 slides or so I quickly click through them to show you what difference it makes when you include economic considerations in the selection and spatial allocation of these BMPs. So we've looked at the Rural Water Quality Program in the largest watershed in which we live and work in Waterloo, that drains into Lake Erie, where we have all these dreadful, harmful algal blooms, for example, and where we try to answer the question, which BMPs should farmers select on their land based on economic considerations, but also especially where that should happen. And this is a very simple graph showing you the ranking of the different types of BMPs that farmers were able to choose from: wetland restoration, buffer strips, nutrient management, which is basically looking at fertilizer application rates, and the cover crops that have been mentioned as well. And so if you look at the kilograms of phosphorus that can be maintained or retained on the land, wetlands do a really great job. So they are the most preferred measure, followed by buffer strips and then some nutrient management plans or fertilizer application rate adjustments and cover crops. If we start introducing financial and economic considerations, the ranking changes. And the ranking also changes if we include the financial cash flows that farmers receive based on the cost-sharing programs versus what the true economic costs are of implementing BMPs. And economists are interested in the broader economic impacts of these BMPs. So it's not just the financial cash flow that covers only part of the cost. We're interested in what does it mean for Ontario's economy as a whole, or the agricultural sector as a whole, if we implement these BMPs. What are the total economic costs, the true economic costs of implementing BMPs? And farmers know these costs. And if we don't modify our incentive mechanisms based on these true economic costs, we won't be able to incentivize them to take up these BMPs. So based on what currently, or over the last 2 decades, we've been paying farmers versus what the true economic costs are, you see that if we introduce financial and economic considerations, the ranking of these BMPs changes. And this is a graph where I'm delineating, I'm breaking up my watershed, the Grand River watershed, in 90 sub-basins, starting from number 1, which are the headwaters. It's in Dundalk, the upstream parts, that's number 1, and number 90 is Dunnville, which is at the mouth of the Grand River that flows into Lake Erie. So we want to reduce our phosphorus loads going into the lake by adopting or implementing these BMPs. And if we look at the financial compensation that farmers receive, this is what the optimum selection and allocation of these different BMPs look like. So many nice colors with a lot of light blue, as you can see. These are the wetlands that we like very much, and for which farmers get a financial compensation. If I change the cost estimation from finance to economics, what you see is that 2 things. One is that the colors change. It means that different types of BMPs are going to be selected. But you can also see, especially if you look at the headwaters, suddenly I don't advise to take any BMPs anymore at all, because what we do upstream doesn't have so much of an impact on the load that ultimately goes into Lake Erie. And the color change is much more orange, which are cover crops. And as you could see from the previous slide, I didn't have a lot of time to explain it, but cover crops were the most preferred measure from an economic point of view because the costs are negative. What does that mean? It means that they're beneficial. Farmers benefit from implementing cover crops. We just need to convince them to implement these cover crops, that in the long term especially, that these cover crops are going to be beneficial for them. Yeah, so the colors change, so the composition of my program of measures in my Grand River watershed changes as a result of flipping from financial costs, the program implementation costs, the cost-sharing schemes that we have available, to accounting for the true economic costs in the basin. And these economic costs are typically higher than the financial costs. It's cost sharing, so farmers don't really get full recovery of the costs that they incur. So why would they take these measures? It means that we need to do a lot of talking with these farmers to convince them that it is really good for society as a whole to take these measures. But why should farmers pay for that? Why should we as consumers, demanding cheap food, not be part of the financing mechanism of what we want farmers to do. Yeah, so a key message is economics is not finance. So even though we do have financial reimbursement systems in place, those do not necessarily reflect the true economic costs. And we're interested in the true economic costs. And the true economic costs will drive farmers' behavior. We don't have that information, so we need to talk with them. They are very reluctant, obviously, to reveal to us, what their true economic costs are. There's asymmetric information, and it gives them a little bit of a position in a negotiation with the government, for example, or a conservation authority, to get most out of the out of this deal. But the current financial incentive system is not incentive compatible, as we say in economics. And then finally, the behavioral change. So the fact that there is very limited success. So I only have data from 10 years ago. I heard Jane say that these BMPs programs have been very successful. The numbers that I have are like 10 to 15 years old. There is very little monitoring, generally speaking, about how successful these programs really are. And when I talk about monitoring, I'm not talking about only looking at the amount of phosphorus that flows into Lake Erie, but also look at behavioral change. Are farmers changing their behavior? Are farmers doing what they're expected to do? Are farmers doing what they're getting paid for? We hardly monitor them. And boy, our farmers are a difficult crowd. We did a survey with them, and it took us more than half a year to get a little bit of response. It was less than 5% of the Ontario farmers that were willing to talk to us and give us some information about how they truly feel about these BMPs. And so that's another part of the work that we conducted. We actually tried to go out and talk with farmers. We had two major farmer organizations, OSCIA and CFFO in Ontario, helping us, but the response rate after 6-7 months was only 5%. And what we did find was that what we know from the international literature outside of Canada is that awareness raising and environmental attitudes, predisposition of farmers towards these BMPs are a key driver to whether or not they decide to adopt them in the first place. What we also find is that farmers that do have positive experiences with certain types of BMPs are great ambassadors for convincing their neighbors to also actually implement them. So that gives us a nice indication of how we can try to also use non-monetary incentives and work with farmers to implement these BMPs. But there's clearly an ongoing need to revisit that existing financial incentive system that we have to see how we can increase the adoption of these BMPs. So that was all that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I would like to thank all of our panelists for sharing this insight with us, and thank you all today. I think I know we wanted to have time at the end for questions, and we've gone over, so my apologies for that. But I want to thank all of you through the Global Water Futures community, because I think one thing that's been really, really amazing about this is that it really started a lot of collaborative relationships that I know are going to continue in the future. We're just figuring out exactly how that's going to look. But anyway, it's exciting times. So I'm going to pass over to Warren.
Thanks. Just one final note, and this is something that I forgot to do at the beginning of the session, but I did want to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And in coming together like this, we pay respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationships with one another. And again, I've overpromised and underdelivered, and we don't have time for questions, but hopefully you can meet some of these guys during the break and ask them your tough questions at that time. Thank you.
Okay, moving right along for our second session of lightning talks. Welcome to all of the volunteers who've decided to share a nugget of their research with us today. So we're beginning with Predrag Rashik. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Predrag, and I'm working on this topic with Professor Brouwer. We're looking into cost effectiveness of wetlands as nature-based solutions for buffering or stopping phosphorus from going into the Great Lakes or other water bodies. And I picked this pretty picture of Lake Erie to motivate my talk. These are algae caused by nutrient runoff. Then that runoff is caused by mostly agricultural practices, but there's some urban activities as well and industrial. Other people have said before me as well that wetlands can be effective in stopping some of that phosphorus from going into the lakes. But as we also heard this morning, it's not free. There are some costs to it, and there are some trade-offs that need to be known and understood to make better decisions. Two major categories of trade-offs are between wetlands, environmental services, so the benefits that we get from them, including phosphorus emission reductions, and alternative land uses, and farmers know that very well, what some alternative uses might be. But we also have trade-offs between wetlands and other ways of reducing phosphorus emissions, and to inform those decisions, we should understand better what those trade-offs are quantitatively, if we can. So what we did here is we synthesized what was available, Canadian literature on reduction of phosphorus emissions and costs were available of those reductions through wetlands, using wetlands. I'm not going to go into detail of these graphs. The point of the graphs is that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of what kinds of wetlands they are. There are what sources of pollution there are as well. What kinds of methods were used to study those wetlands. Sometimes it was simulation, sometimes actual measuring, experimental. And then what kinds of costs were reported. That was the most fun part for me. Lots of heterogeneity in the kinds of costs and accounting for those. And again, here in these pictures, I just want to focus on the summary statistics. For example, what is the average, or what is the median first, cost of stopping 1 kilogram of phosphorus from going into the lakes? $120, but that's the median. We see there's lots of heterogeneity there as well, quite a bit. What's the average? And you probably guessed that it's higher than the median because of all of this spread. There's quite a bit more that we know about it that we can talk about later. After this, we are focusing on what factors drive these differences. We see that there's lots of heterogeneity there in the costs. Is it the size of wetlands? Does it matter? Does it matter where they are? Does the province matter? And so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. And for those of you who'd like to know more, his poster is number 41. Now we are going to introduce Joyce Simos. Thanks.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Joey Simos. I'm a hydrologist with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I'm here today to share with you strategies that we've come up to spatially target beneficial management practices like wetlands in Canadian prairie watersheds to basically maximize their water quality benefits. So the tool we're using to do this is the Prioritized Target and Measure application, or PTM app for short. And if you're unfamiliar with this tool, what it essentially allows us to do is to determine the spatial distribution of non-point source nutrient loads, to determine the feasibility of different practices, and then evaluate the effectiveness of those practices to reduce nutrient loads across watersheds. So in a typical application of the PTMAP model, you would assess your BMP performance for 1 in 2 year or 1 in 10 year 24-hour rainfall events. But in this application of the model, we sought out to evaluate 2 unique characteristics of Canadian prairie hydrology. The first is that we wanted to evaluate spring runoff events rather than rainfall events, as we know that these contribute larger masses of nutrient loads to downstream receiving bodies of water. The second aspect of hydrology in the prairies we want to address was non-contributing areas. So we used 2D hydrodynamic modeling to identify these, to help screen out BMPs within these because they would provide lower benefits during typical flow years. And we did all this work using a combination of HEC HMS, HEC RAS, and water quality analysis modeling that we collected field measurements for. So I just want to mention that although this work wasn't produced under the GWF program, rather just the recently wrapped up Living Lab Eastern Prairies, you might be wondering what the heck I'm doing here. The reason I'm here is to also share with you that IISD has recently launched a new 5-year fully funded initiative called the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions Initiative, where we're aiming to take natural infrastructure from novel to normal. So we're building our network of partners right now with anyone who's working in similar areas of research to us, including business case development like the modeling I just showed, municipal adoption, the mobilization of funding, or any sort of related policy to natural infrastructure. So if any of the modeling I just showed you or natural infrastructure interests you, come find me and let's connect. Thanks.
Thank you, Joy. I'd like to call up Lamisa Malik, please.
Hi, I'm Lamisa Malik. So many of you know that algal blooms are a frequent occurrence in Canadian lakes and rivers due to the high level of phosphorus concentration coming from agricultural land. Despite of efforts to reduce, why it changed? Sorry. Is it changing by itself? Oh. Anyway, my apologies. Okay. So despite efforts to reduce phosphorus load over several decades, these blooms persist in our lakes. So studies indicate that these blooms are not result due to the current land use practices, but also due to the accumulation of legacy phosphorus that is continue to mix in our water even after we stop our phosphorus inputs. So therefore, it's very important to estimate this legacy phosphorus, to develop target strategies, and to achieve realistic outcome from our strategies. So to assess this situation, we developed a simple phosphorus mass balance for 60 years from 1961 to 2021 at county scale level. And we found that the phosphorus has increased, the phosphorus surplus has increased over these years, basically due to the high fertilizer use in the landscape. So then we estimated the legacy phosphorus accumulation, and we coupled them with phosphorus use efficiency, and we found that like most vulnerable areas in Canadian provinces and like them, and we found that Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec has the most intensification of phosphorus due to the increase of inputs, and the Saskatchewan shows the opposite. So we saw the soil mining of phosphorus from the Saskatchewan. So my poster number is 79. If you wanted to talk more about it and discuss about it, please, you're welcome to visit it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamisa. So next we have Ruchi Bhattacharya.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruchi Bhattacharya. I'm a postdoc at University of Waterloo with Dr. Nandita Basu. So I'm going to quickly find my presentation. Bear with me. Okay, so we know that reservoirs and dams are very important. They're everywhere, and they're an integral part of the terrestrial aquatic continuum. But when we think about reservoirs and dams, we need to think about them as important nodes of socio-ecological systems. And what I mean by that is they essentially provide a range of ecosystem services or resource units, such as drinking water, hydroelectricity, recreational facilities, which are then utilized by a range of stakeholders, ranging from rural to urban communities, farmer organizations, irrigation organizations, and they're managed by people ranging from nonprofit organizations, conservation groups, and so on. There are distinct interactions between these two groups, which then defines how the watershed that drains into these reservoirs and how the reservoirs themselves are managed, which in turn affects how the reservoir biogeochemical processes are manifested and the water quality conditions are manifested, and also the downstream impacts. Now, you cannot really ignore the hydroclimatic variability in the background and how that affects all these processes and management decision-making. So when we think about reservoirs, it's very important to have the conversation where we think about the socio-ecological framework within which these systems lies. And these are important communications that we need to have when we think about how to manage them. So my project basically talks about the interplay between reservoir usage and hydroclimate, how that affects stakeholder decisions and reservoir management, and eventually what is the environmental footprint of these reservoirs. So we talk about more of this in our poster, number 71. If this piques your interest, I encourage you to stop by and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchi. Poster number 71, then. So Ayud is next. Ayud Ian.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hao Yin from the University of Waterloo, and I'm currently working with Professor David Rudolph, Professor Jeff McKenzie, and Dr. Andrew Wibb. So our research is to trying to find out what's the influence of dynamic river stage on the vulnerability of water wells and the structure foundations in cold regions. So the reason why our research is important is that many communities in cold regions are established along rivers, and at the same time, they are relying on groundwater for their freshwater resources. But the problem they have is that their water supply wells are constructed within the shallow aquifer, which might be hydraulically connected with the surrounding rivers. And during the spring and summer seasons, the river stage fluctuates because of the melt of the snow and ice. But to our best knowledge, there's no standard vulnerability assessment approach that consider this river stage fluctuation. And at the same time, the river stage fluctuation can also cause groundwater flooding, and this may also impact the household basement along the riverbank. So what we did is that we choose a community in central Yukon, and we choose that as our study site and build a three-dimensional numerical model for that community. And we simulate the groundwater flow, surface water flow, and also the solute transport under the dynamic river stage. And so far, we have found really interesting simulation result, and part of the result are posted on the poster number 49. So if you guys are interested to our research, please come to our poster, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yu. So finally, our last speaker is Tian Yu.
Good morning. Have you guys ever tried ChatGPT? Well, I did last night. Artificial intelligence, or some say machine learning, is benefiting our daily lives. And as a hardworking PhD student, I'm always on the lookout for new ways to embrace my inner laziness. I see people use machine learning in stock markets, logistics. Why can't we use it in groundwater studies? I'm a groundwater guy, and I think we don't get enough attention, and we don't get the most fundings. But things are about to change because I decided to follow the hype and use the buzzword machine learning in my study. I've been using physical hydrological models, but I always have this question. So how can we really describe the complex natural system using just some empirical equations? I just play with some parameters and let it run for a week and hope for the best. Sometimes it's just frustrating and exhausting. But on the other hand, machine learning algorithms are designed to capture nonlinear relationships better than human brains can do. So I just replaced my physical models with 7 different machine learning algorithms. It is much easier to build. It can take incomplete data. It automatically adjusts parameters, and it can update itself using new observation data. Most of all, it makes pretty good predictions. But of course, it's not that easy. So come to my poster and talk to me if you're interested in machine learning and groundwater.
Thank you, Jinyu. That's it for our lightning talks this last session. Many thanks to the presenters, and I hope they've piqued your curiosity. Go and see their posters.
Okay. I know it's been a long morning, and probably like me, you're cold. I had to throw on my sweater here just to warm up. I'd like to invite our speakers to come up. Jeff and who else have we got? We're still missing one. There's Elliot's with us. Great. Okay, so we'll get our crew up and we'll get started. Amen. Good to see you.
Ready to bring in
Sarah, yeah. So we've got a hybrid session this morning. One of our speakers is going to be calling in, so we'll be manipulating that at the end. Welcome to our session. We're talking about changing groundwater, and I'd like to thank Chris and the whole team for helping us put this all together and facilitating everything here. It's been a great opportunity to be here and meet with everyone again. My name's Dave Rudolph. I'm a hydrogeologist at the University of Waterloo, and I'll be moderating this morning along with my colleague Grant Ferguson, who you'll meet shortly. He's doing double duty as a speaker as well, University of Saskatchewan. Within Groundwater Futures, within Global Water Futures, groundwater has played a significant role in so many different projects. And in order to try to give you a breadth of what that work has been, we've selected 4 different topics that we'll go through, and our speakers are here to go through that. We're very fortunate to have 4 of Canada's leading hydrogeologists with us today to go through that. And it'll give us an idea of sort of the breadth of work that's been going on here. So the session outline will be like this. I'll give you just a brief introduction and sort of a context to what the work's been like throughout Global Water Futures. And then we'll have 4 thematic presentations. Grant will talk to us about groundwater in the prairies. Jeff McKenzie's here, we'll be focusing on northern groundwater issues. Elliot Skierskan will be talking to us about how thawing permafrost is influencing geogenic movement in groundwater systems. And Sarah Dixon-Anderson will be calling in from Hamilton, and we'll be following up on work she's been doing in private water well management. So as we've seen through the last couple of days, and we'll see carrying on for the next few days, Many of the issues related to impact on water throughout the world, and a lot of the topics we're working on in Groundwater Futures, Global Water Futures, I'll do that one more time, are pretty obvious if you look at them from a visual point of view. So terrestrial water, let's think about glaciers receding and the rapid rate of that. It's something that's very easy to see. The problem itself is very visual. The same type of thing can be said about reservoirs and lakes. So maybe one of the poster children of reservoirs impacted by overexploitation, impact from drought and changes in water balance is, of course, is Lake Mead, very obvious impact. And you've seen many pictures of this during the last couple of days on impact from high nutrient loading to lakes, including very large lakes. Here's Lake Winnipeg. Groundwater, on the other hand, here's an image I got from it just last week. This is what most groundwater looks like. So it's very difficult to visually understand the problems associated with it. It's underground, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. This is in its natural habitat. So part of our challenge is to try to make this invisibility visible again. It's a term that was used last year by the UN, who designated groundwater as being the topic for World Water Day. And this theme of making the invisible visible was really the focus worldwide. And our researchers within Global Water Futures have been trying to do that, and our presentations today will really focus on that, to bring some of this visibility to the obvious interpretation of the problems. So many of us have seen this type of diagram before. This is just the water balance, sort of a global water balance. Nothing new there. What's interesting about it, and for our session today, of course, is that the groundwater reservoir is extremely enormous, so extremely large volume of water relative to fresh water, still is small relative to what's trapped and entombed in glaciers and ice sheets, which, as we know, are rapidly thawing. So the contribution of that water balance in these columns that we see here is changing. But I like this particular diagram because it adds another component to it. So if we take the surface water and sort of blow it up a little bit and break it into its pieces, what we find is that there's an extremely large component that's still entombed in the subsurface, is frozen in ice and frost, that, as we know, is on this process of thawing at a rapid rate. So the water balance in this sort of terrestrial water world is changing quickly. That's going to influence the water balance and probably influence water quality substantially, and that's maybe even atmospheric quality, which has been a topic of discussion. So Global Water Futures has worked extensively on this particular issue of thawing of this entombed or entrapped water and being released back to the hydrologic system. So from a Canadian point of view, and John always likes us to have some statistics, people would estimate that in terms of available fresh water, the groundwater reservoir likely represents something like 95% of available fresh water, which is an extremely large resource and reservoir. But if you look in Canada, thinking of all the surface water we have, an estimate between 1970 and 2015 was an increase from about 10% dependence on groundwater to close to 30% dependence on groundwater, so something like 10 million Canadians using that as a drinking water supply. That's just drinking water. So as time goes on, and this data, of course, is 6 or 7 years old now, but as we go on, we anticipate the dependency on the groundwater resource to continually increase. And this is for a whole variety of reasons, primarily because of over-allocation or maximum allocation of surface water sources. So we'll need to look somewhere else for that resource. And also, of course, for a new sort of a switch and trend towards irrigation, which hasn't been significant in Canada and is now starting to become more considered. We heard a little bit about that this morning. But across Canada, even in Ontario now, 40% of our water supply comes from groundwater resources. If you're on the far east coast, Prince Edward Island is 100% dependent on groundwater, and we'll hear about the Yukon shortly. In the Yukon, again, we're close to 100% dependent on groundwater. So it's a very vital drinking water supply and overall water supply throughout Canada. And I couldn't resist putting a picture of me beside my first flowing artesian well. So that was a couple of years ago now. So to get started, I'd first like to invite Grant Ferguson to come to the stage here. We'll get his presentation set up. Grant is a professor of hydrogeology in civil, geological, environmental engineering at University of Saskatchewan, and he's been studying the topic he'll speak to us about today, prairie groundwater, for several decades. And Grant is an outspoken advocate for groundwater in Canada, has been and continues to be, and we'll invite him to the stage here to talk to us about that. Thanks, Grant. If I can get our...
Thanks, Dave. So, groundwater in the prairies. I guess I'll qualify that a little bit, and as was pointed out in the session earlier this morning, the prairies are pretty diverse. I've worked in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta throughout my career, although this one is going to be mostly focused on Saskatchewan being kind of grounded where we're at here, so apologies to our neighbors to the east and west. The other thing I'm going to touch on, kind of wrap into this presentation, this whole idea of making the invisible visible. And I remember at one point, one of my colleagues, Tom Gleason, saying that groundwater is not very photogenic, and that may be true, as Dave's photo provides some evidence for. But through the Global Water Futures projects, we did have the opportunity. It was myself and Jen McIntosh at University of Arizona, who's an adjunct professor at University of Saskatchewan, had the opportunity to work with Louise Arnell, part of the Virtual Water Gallery, which is now actual, not virtual so much. So if you have a chance, you didn't get to see it last night, go check it out. I've got a bit of her artwork wrapped into the presentation here. So really, I guess what we're interested in is, what does the future hold for groundwater in the prairies? So we do have the possibility of increased demand. So where's that extra water going to come from? Maybe it's increased population growth. Maybe it's increasing demands for different types of agriculture as we shift to increased irrigation, maybe different types of crop as opportunities arise with our changing climate. But there's a lot of uncertainty around that. One thing I will also say is I've heard this a number of times, so we'll I guess nip that in the bud right off the hop here, is this idea that, especially in Saskatchewan, it's like, well, all the groundwater is saline. It's like, well, we have some saline groundwater, but just like everything else in the prairies, it's pretty diverse, right? We've got low salinity groundwater that's excellent quality. We've also got some stuff that, it's not exactly what you'd want to drink, but, you are where you are sometimes, and that's the water supply you have. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and one of the big questions we've asked here through a few different projects, old meets new, prairie groundwater is kind of a separate project from prairie water, and then within prairie water itself is mostly how is groundwater connected to the rest of the hydrologic cycle. So we do have some ideas around that, and the other thing that we really focused in on was kind of the water energy nexus, and in the Canadian prairies, a lot of that means how do we interface with the oil industry. So those are things I'm going to touch on briefly as we go through here. So just to be inclusive, and it's not all my work, we've worked with a lot of great people here. I'm one of those people who is, I believe, off in Japan on sabbatical right now, is Masaki Hayashi. So we have thought a lot about how much groundwater recharge do we have in the Canadian prairies? What does that look like? What is that flux of water into the ground and probably out of the ground? And so Masaki and his students and postdocs have looked into this in detail, and the answer is basically what we thought it would be, and it's not much. Recharge rates, and this is Alberta, and they have moved into Saskatchewan, but I don't think that work is quite polished and ready to show yet. But recharge rates that are typically less than 30 millimeters per year, and often less than that in some regions. But I guess where this comes in, and questions that we've asked, is like, sure, that's what's going into the ground. Where does that actually go? And so this is work that a student who worked with me early on during GWF, actually through another project that kind of morphed into part of GWF, which was David Ferris. And these are ideas that have been around for years and years, and Garth Vanderkamp, who was heavily involved with a lot of things with GIWS and GWF early on in the project, retiring a couple of years ago. this idea that, we've got our weathered zone for a lot of our glacial tills in Saskatchewan and our adjacent areas of the prairies, that really most of that is permeable or higher permeability in the upper maybe 10 meters or so. And David went through and compiled data from everywhere, including a pretty substantial amount from engineering consultants that wasn't publicly available, and we've made that public. And turns out, of course, Garth was right. He's thought long and hard about a lot of these things, but it looks like a lot of that water that's going into the ground is recharge. It's not actually getting to the aquifers that we would tap into for a water supply. So for some context there, we've got our more permeable sediments in the upper 10, 15 meters or so. The average water well in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba aren't that much different. It's about 30 meters, right? So it's not actually getting down to that level. And so we took that one step further in thinking about what's connected to what. And a lot of the story here, and this isn't new from something I've figured out. This goes back to work that was done a long time ago, early days by Earl Christensen, who looked at the glacial geology of the prairies. And I guess really started to figure it out was Steve Grasby maybe about 25 years ago, thinking about, well, what does the chemistry tell us about where these waters have come from? So we followed up on that with, I guess, support from a lot of people. This is Chandler Noy's PhD thesis that was just defended, I guess, earlier this spring. And so we looked at a variety of different age tracers, and through some modeling, we managed to figure this out and come up with some estimates. So it turns out that a lot of our groundwater beneath our feet here, it's thousands of years old, right? So whatever's going on with climate change, whatever it does, droughts, flooding, we're not really seeing that have a rapid response in the subsurface. So that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because what that means is that supply is probably going to be immune to whatever happens over the coming decades. But it also brings some questions about, well, if we use that, how's that going to come back? So we see some of these things in the intertill aquifers beneath us. It might be, maybe 15, 20 meters, those first aquifers we would tap into, that those waters are typically some sort of mixed signal that, a bit of ice age water, maybe a bit of something else, but typically, 5 to maybe 15,000 years old. And we found some other waters looking at the Barry Valley aquifers. So I think the oldest one there is from the Tyner Valley west of the city here. That was beyond radiocarbon dating, which will get you to about 40,000 years. And we used helium-4, which is another isotope system. And our best guess is it's probably somewhere around 75,000 years old. So back through, the last glacial maximum into something else. So pretty locked off and isolated, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around how exactly that connects to the rest of the hydrologic cycle. So shifting gears a little bit, thinking about the other part of what we looked at here, and I see time is running on me here, but I think Dave said we probably have a bit more time than what we thought. A bit more artwork. So this was some of the stuff that I was thinking about as I started to work with Louise. So this is Unseen Worlds, which is trying to paint the picture of, the subsurface can be a pretty crowded place, and just a bit of context on that, thinking about what we have in Western Canada. There's a few 100,000 water wells. There's about 100,000 in this province, and similar amounts in Manitoba, a few more in Alberta. And there's like 750,000 oil and gas wells in Western Canada, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure down there. It's a crowded place, and you start to think about all the different things that are down there, right? We talk about, there's hydraulic fracturing, there's, carbon capture, potential for geothermal energy, and all of our legacy oil and gas. So Louise took that, and this is her chaotic cycle, thinking about everything that's moved around in the subsurface, and we've written about that. And so some of it is pretty obvious, the impacts we've seen from the oil and gas industry, and maybe this is where that kicks in, and those waters that are separated from the rest of the hydrologic cycle. It is important. We had a student look at oil and gas spills and their distribution in Saskatchewan. There's something like 25,000 over the last couple decades, so large impact there. What's maybe not quite as obvious, talk about how much recharge and what's going into the groundwater system. The biggest churn of water in the subsurface is not natural here in Saskatchewan. It's what the oil and gas industry is up to. So thinking about what that looks like, and these are net fluid volume per unit area, so essentially a recharge. But what this is injecting and producing water that the oil industry is doing, either the water that comes up with the oil, or injecting water in to pressurize up or reservoirs and push that oil out. So there's a lot of water being used and turned around. What those effects are, we haven't seen them yet. Are they important? I guess to be determined. And thinking about other things, so this is work by Chris Paris, so trying to highlight the work of some of the students who've worked with me on some of these projects, and thinking about, well, what are the risks, right? There's so much discussion around hydraulic fracturing, and maybe we're a little bit more comfortable with that here in the prairies than in other regions. But looking at this in detail, it's probably not the latest, greatest hydraulic fracturing that's going to be the problem. Some of that is pretty scrutinized, and I think we have reasonable regulations for a lot of our oil and gas industry. We can debate whether or not we want that carbon coming up and what that might do to the climate. But in terms of a risk to water supplies, I think some of the issues are probably more related to legacy impacts, right? Think about how we were drilling wells back in the 1950s and 60s before we thought about a lot of the things we thought about today. So what we've got here is research that Chris Parra did as part of his master's thesis, thinking about what this actually looks like. So what we're looking at there is those, I guess, vertical, the columns are all different wells that were drilled, and then how they were plugged, which is the gray. So the point there is we've got what would have been abandoned holes, casings pulled for these older wells, and basically everything's connected beneath that point, right? So that's kind of scary if we think about what that might mean to some of these deeper aquifers if they somehow become strategic. On the other hand, we haven't seen anybody jumping up and down yet, so perhaps it's not the issue we think it is. So just to wrap up, and another one, maybe one of my favorites by Louise here, are we ready if we need to pump more groundwater? So we're going to need to get into thinking about, a more predictive approach, more hydraulic testing, more environmental tracers, need to think beyond recharge, legacy impacts of oil and gas. And one thing that we really haven't done a great job of here, and I think it's because groundwater is often out of sight, out of mind for us, is that we are going to have to push to engage more users to get them thinking about what this might look like in their future, because we haven't had the uptake on, and I guess in terms of interest from communities that some of the other projects have had. So with that, I'm a couple minutes over, but hopefully we still got lots of time for our other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, Grant, thanks very much, and thanks for reminding us of the legacy of development of oil wells throughout Canada. That's one of the things we'll have to be dealing with. There's no two ways about it. Okay, we'll move on to our next talk, and we're glad to have Jeff McKenzie with us here. Jeff's a professor of hydrogeology and earth and planetary sciences at McGill University in Montreal. And he may be the most well-known and active cryohydrogeologist in Canada, a term he, I think, may have come up with, but is suitable in building a whole new area of work and lots of experience in the north. So we're going to move from the prairies and head up to the colder northern regions now. Jeff's also department chair, again, against his better judgment, and manages to balance these administrative duties with his research. And we're glad to have him join us today. Jeff.
Right, thank you for having me. It's really great to see all the presentations this morning and to be here as part of this groundwater panel. So I thought I'd present today some work coming out of a project that was funded through Global Water Futures, really trying to understand, as the title defines, northern groundwater vulnerability. And this is a group of people working on this project, and so when I listed sort of the authors on this talk, I put myself last, because really what I'm going to show today is the work of our amazing students and researchers, part of this group. Andrew Wiebe, who's at Waterloo now and who was at McGill as a postdoc. Hao Yu, who you just saw give a short lightning talk before, talking about CARMAX and flooding and how this affects groundwater. Chelsea Stribling, who's studying, hopefully, for her PhD comprehensive exams at the end of this week at McGill University, a PhD student. Brendan Mulligan and Isabelle de Grandpré, who are our government partners from the Yukon and Northwest Territories, the two hydrogeologists for these two huge areas, and Dave Rudolph, who you just met as well, and myself. So just talking about this project that's been going on for the past couple of years, funded through Global Water Futures. So northern groundwater resources. As Dave mentioned, some people in the north like to use groundwater as their drinking water supply. So if we think about Yukon territory, almost, I think it's now 97% of Yukoners, when they turn on the tap in their home, it's groundwater that comes out of their tap. And this really stands out if we compare this, say, to Northwest Territories, where less than 5% of the population uses groundwater. Most of the population in Northwest Territory uses surface water, like water coming from rivers or lakes. And so the picture at the bottom here is from Wati in the Northwest Territories. Wati is a few hours drive from Yellowknife. They just finally have an all-season road. Before you had to take an ice road to get to Wati if you wanted to drive, only during the winter. And if you look in this picture, the sort of the red house to the left here, inside this house is a pump that draws up groundwater from the Lamart Lake, essentially, that goes through the ground and into this well here. And so this community is a few hundred people, and all of their water goes to this pump house. And then it's delivered by truck every day to the different houses in the community. So in the north, I'm sure you've heard, there's permafrost, so the perennially frozen ground. As hydrogeologists, we think of permafrost often as being impermeable to groundwater flow. So where you have permafrost, groundwater is not really able to move. And with warming, we think the Arctic is warming at 2 to 4 times the global average rate due to climate change. We think a lot of things are going to change. Permafrost is going to thaw. There's going to be increased groundwater flux. There'll be more transport of solutes through the subsurface, such as carbon. More potential for contaminant transport. So if we have some sort of spill that gets into the ground, there's more potential for it to move with more groundwater flow. More groundwater resource development. So more potential for people to put wells in and extract groundwater to use for domestic or industrial purposes. More infrastructure degradation by groundwater. And also really a need, as we increase the amount of groundwater usage, to really start thinking about better planning and policy around groundwater resources. So given this context, a key tool that hydrogeologists use and groundwater resource managers use is called groundwater vulnerability assessment. So this has been around, I guess, for a while. 1994 was some of the first publications that came out about this, and the idea is that all groundwater is vulnerable, and it's an intrinsic property of a groundwater system that depends on the sensitivity of that system to human or natural impacts. So what are we talking about with this intrinsic property? Has to do with the geology, so what type of aquifers we have, or pictures like Grant showed of sort of the distribution of permeability with depth. Has to do with the environment, what type of pollutants might get into the groundwater system, and also potential pollution sources. And this is sort of not sort of an arm-waving, I'm waving my arm saying this, but it's not an arm-waving idea when we talk about groundwater vulnerability assessment. For most, say, southern regions, if you have groundwater resources that people were doing for drinking water, a groundwater vulnerability assessment is often actually required. So someone needs to go in, often consultants, and assess just how vulnerable a groundwater system might be. And it's worth noting, I always like this quote, the first law of groundwater vulnerability is all groundwater is vulnerable. So if you are getting groundwater from a groundwater system, if you're getting your water from a groundwater system, it is potentially vulnerable to contamination or to degradation over time. So then the question is northern groundwater vulnerable? And so this is a table from Andrew Wiebe in a publication, a commentary about this that we have hopefully to be published sometime this year. And so we can think about the population of Canada's different territories and provinces and how many known contaminated sites there are. So each province or territory actually has lists of how many contaminated sites there are. And so we look, for example, here in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Alberta, and Yukon, there are a lot of contaminated sites for the given population. So this is a number of contaminated sites per 10,000 people. NWT has 372 contaminated sites for every 10,000 people living there. And so for these northern areas, and Alberta, it's like almost an order of magnitude more contaminated sites per person than it is for the rest of the southern provinces. So this, I think, really shows that there is a high potential for groundwater to be vulnerable and contaminated. So given this context, we came up with this idea of a northern groundwater vulnerability assessment. Think about how we can build better tools and better understanding of groundwater vulnerability in the north. And so I'll just go through quickly. I'm already behind schedule, but I'll go through quickly and just talk about 4 things that we did as part of this project. So one, working with the Yukon government and Northwest Territories government, we came up with a program called Under the Land, which was the community cogeneration of northern groundwater knowledge. Basically, we went and visited a bunch of communities in the Yukon and NWT and talked to people about groundwater. Tried to understand what were people's concerns about groundwater contamination. We even spent a couple days at a kids' STEM camp, Dave and I, and Andrew, and we ran some groundwater events for kids. This is the picture from this, where they had to run around and learn about the water cycle. It's, to say the least, while we talked about cogeneration of knowledge, really, I think we were the learners in this case. It was incredible seeing what people were doing and trying their understanding of groundwater and how little we actually understood. Another project we did is just to actually understand how might contaminants move through a system that has permafrost. So this is just a really simple model that we built. Celsi Stribling, our PhD student, built this. And it's a layer of permafrost, and it's unfrozen around the permafrost, and talus, basically holes in the permafrost on either side. And we said, what would happen if at the upgradient side a contaminant was to spill? How would it move through this system? And so I'll quickly show you one result of this. So the top panel here is temperature. So the blues and whites are where the ground is frozen, and the red is where the ground is not frozen and is permeable to groundwater flow. In the lower panel, you'll see some colors develop, and this is where contaminants are moving through the subsurface. As this has seasonal freezing and thawing. So at the top, you can see that sort of pulsing up and down. That is the active zone opening and closing, or the active layer opening and closing every winter. And so really interesting results that we hadn't thought too much about, but that this flow under the permafrost is actually quite fast compared to the shallower flow of contaminants. So this is really interesting work, and we're going through in a systematic way, understanding different scenarios, how they might affect contaminant transport. We also did some work in Carmacks, which is a few hours drive north of Whitehorse. And this is what Hao Yu, who had the poster and gave a lightning talk, but I encourage you to go talk to Hao Yu about his results at the poster break. So Carmacks have been really affected in the past few years by flooding of the Yukon River, leading to a lot of boil water advisories and concerns about water quality. And this is just a hydrograph of the flood from, I think this was a couple years ago. So really extensive high water events in Carmacks. So Hao Yu has used a model called hydrogeosphere, and we're able to build a model of how water would get to the community's, the municipality's groundwater well. And so these little red lines here, they show the path that groundwater would flow to get to the well. And so the lower panel shows sort of the side view of what those look like, and the top view is sort of the map view of how we get here. And so we can see that as flooding, as the river level rises, the path that groundwater takes to get to the well changes. And so one thing that we were not quite expecting, in retrospect, we should have expected it, as the river gets to its highest stage, the well really starts pulling primarily river water towards the well. And so this has really potential issues around contaminants from the river getting to that groundwater well. And these are just snapshots. There's a travel time question, so it's not saying it's just groundwater that's getting to the well, but it does show there's a real potential for this to happen. So talk to Hao Yu at the poster time, and he can tell you more about this, but really, really interesting results. And the final thing we worked on, Andrew worked a lot on this, is can we build better tools for capture zone analysis? So if we have a pumping well, that well doesn't just take water from everywhere. It has sort of a region, a capture zone that it pulls water to that well. And so Andrew did a really nice job and built a web tool. So if you're in a small community, you can go to this website, put in what your pumping rate for your well would be, and a little bit of the geology of the area, and the well will tell you what's your capture zone. So this year I showed that first picture I showed, or one of the first ones, was of Wati in the Northwest Territories. So this triangle you see on the right shows what the capture zone would look like, and that yellow line is where we think permafrost might be. So it's sort of blocking potential contaminants getting to the well. And then we can use this tool to see what will happen if that permafrost starts moving backwards, and how this would potentially affect vulnerability for this well. So I'll wrap up here and just say a few things. As opposed to conclusions, I think we still have a lot of future challenges we need to address. Groundwater vulnerability assessment is a critical tool that needs to be brought in to more places in the north. These assessments must include local knowledge. If we learned anything in this project, is that we don't know a lot. We have incredibly powerful groundwater models, but understanding the local context is absolutely important in how we apply these vulnerability assessment tools. Field data is needed. So we have a lot of surface water, we have a lot of weather stations, a lot of snow measurements. We do not have a lot of groundwater data. The Yukon is doing a great job. I think now the Yukon is up to 65 or 70 groundwater observation wells, most of them put in the last few years. We do not have long records of groundwater data here, so a lot to do in terms of field data needing to be collected. And the final thing to say, after this project, I think we have more questions than answers. And a lot more to do. So this project is not ending now as groundwater future. I mean, global water futures, starts to wind down, but I think we have a lot of new projects coming online based on findings from this project. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. And we're going to stay up north for our next talk, and I'm going to invite Elliot Skierskan to join us. And Elliot has a prestigious Banting postdoctoral fellowship working here at the University of Saskatchewan. His work's been focused on the release of geogenic compounds from thawing permafrost environments, and he's going to review a lot of that work with us today. And he's been working extensively within the Global Water Futures programs at sites within the Yukon as well. So we'll invite Elliot.
Thank you. It seems like glaciers are melting and permafrost is thawing, which is a good thing because we need to fill up our groundwater reservoirs, right? So my work in the north started after my PhD on a project with, ultimately for Yukon government. There was a big interest in mineral exploration in an area in western Yukon, and these companies are spending millions of dollars doing groundwater assessments and finding arsenic and uranium, and that kind of sparked a bit of an interest to understand at a bigger scale what's happening with groundwater in this area. There's natural sources of some of these elements, which uranium arsenic can be toxic, hazardous, and so that got me into working into northern groundwater. And the big question I had as I moved into this setting and learned about permafrost and how it controls how water moves underground, the burning question I had at the time was, if this stuff thaws, how does that change the groundwater quality? Because we had these areas where there already was poor groundwater quality, and it had nothing to do with contamination from human activity. This is all, groundwater as it is before any impacts from industrial activity or other human contamination. And so I came into this project with a big hypothesis. Thawing permafrost can activate chemical reactions and groundwater flow paths, so there'll be groundwater moves that could potentially release hazardous, naturally occurring elements. And Dave, I object to your comment about groundwater being invisible. So I have this great photo here of an acidic groundwater spring. That's that interesting colored pond on the right that's entering a stream bank. And this is one of the exceptional cases where you can see acidic groundwater. It's acidic from natural weathering of minerals in the rock in this area entering a stream. And so, here's a visible expression of why groundwater can directly matter from a surface perspective. Jeff introduced the concept of frozen ground and how it makes ground impermeable to water flow, and that really controls hydrology in northern regions. And the only thing I'll add to that is that when water is frozen, chemical reactions are very much prohibited because you need liquid water to interact with microbes and to interact with minerals, and that really controls what the water contains. And so once that permafrost thaws, there's a potential for chemical reactions that haven't been available for the last several thousands of years. And so I came into this project with the Banting Fellowship, but with an additional funds from Global Water Futures. And what that has really allowed us to do is take this question at a much bigger scale. So I'll speak a little bit to that in the few minutes I have with you here. So there's a long list of people who've been involved in the work and organizations. They're all listed here. And there's kind of a three-pronged approach that we've taken. So the first is, thanks to our partnership with Yukon government, in particular Brendan Mulligan, the hydrogeologist there, who've drawn our attention to a number of areas in Yukon where anecdotally, or if you look at news stories or you read reports, you hear people have issues where wells need to be treated or abandoned because they are dealing with natural uranium or arsenic issues. And so one of the projects that we've undertaken here is to just collect all the data of groundwater that we can over the scale of the territory and get a sense for what is the state of groundwater chemistry in this area. And in parallel with that, we've done some targeted field sampling at some field sites where we know there's, from the previous work I was doing before arriving at the University of Saskatchewan, there's elevated uranium and arsenic in the groundwater, but we don't know anything about what the permafrost contains. And so we've been interested in sampling the permafrost and looking at its chemistry, and then doing lab experiments to look at when this stuff thaws, what is the chemistry of the water that comes off of it. So very quickly, I'll give some high-level overview of some of these results. And first, Anna Grunsky at McMaster University is working with Sean Carey on this groundwater assessment of groundwater in the territory. And we can see there's a high proportion of groundwater wells that are containing arsenic or uranium, or sometimes both. And Anna's working to really understand what are the geological factors that explain that, and that really is useful in a territory where there's big population growth, people are needing to secure new water supplies, and this work can help inform some areas where maybe there's geological settings that are better for installing a well, and some settings that are that should be avoided. A lot of the work that I've done on what contains what's the chemistry of permafrost water as it thaws is from the Dawson Range, so it's in western Yukon here. And so this is where I started my northern research. And there's a couple companies there that have proposed mine projects, Newmont and Casino. And they've been very supportive of this work. Essentially, our argument to them, so they've always supported our work in terms of data sharing and giving us site access when I started on this. But when we became interested in permafrost thaw, our big conversation with them was that they're spending millions of dollars installing wells, trying to understand water quality in their groundwater and in their streams, and they're applying for permits to open mines in the future, and the government needs to review their applications, and they have water quality objectives. You need to maintain, this level of concentrations in your streams downstream of your operation, and those concentrations could be changing through time. And so that was, for them, I think, a big thing to be interested in and supporting us access some of the field sites here, which we really need their support because this is 200 kilometers from any road access, so we have to stage out of their fly-in exploration camps. And so in my first summer at USask, we did some permafrost coring. So here's an overview. There's the Yukon River cutting across the map, and we collected cores from a bunch of catchments. Some were directly down gradient of where the proposed mine projects are, and I just want to emphasize they're proposed mine projects, so there's no actual mining as of yet, so we're very much studying kind of the baseline environment. And some of the cores are collected in catchments where there's no proposed upstream mining. And getting into this project, I felt like I had these ideas about permafrost thaw that went into proposals, brought in a lot of public funding, and I guess felt maybe a bit of imposter syndrome, like, well, we've got all this money now, but is this like just a concern over nothing? And it's now a fair bit of research money that's gone into this work. As the results have started to come in the last months, last year of work, they've really validated our concerns. So, for example, from the Dawson Range cores, these box plots show the water that comes out of the active layer, so the layer above permafrost, and then the water that comes out of the thawed permafrost. And the horizontal lines are guidelines that are protective of aquatic life. And let's pick on arsenic, for example. I lost my train of thought here. So I wasn't necessarily surprised to see high arsenic in some of the cores that were down gradient of the proposed mine projects, because there's a well-known association of arsenic and gold. That's the geological association. But with the extent of coring that we've done, and we've seen this persistent issue in a really wide range of settings that aren't necessarily down gradient of those deposits. And so that's very much, for me, an eyebrow-raising result that really speaks to the validation of the work and the funding that's gone into doing this. We've also done some column experiments. So this is Matt Felwach's master's thesis, and he's got a poster here, poster number 52. Same number of cards as in a deck of cards, if you need to remember. And so he's taken these materials and thawed them in a lab setting where we're pumping water through them and looking at how the chemistry comes out through time. And without getting into all of the details, what we're seeing is a very high release. So this is uranium concentrations from one of his column experiments. And if you're familiar with any of these numbers, they're incredibly high relative to what would be considered safe for drinking water or for aquatic life. So again, every time we get new results on this, it's like, okay, this is really worth looking into further. Having access to the synchrotron here in Saskatoon, we're also able to use this tool to understand what are the sources of these elements in these frozen soil samples and understand the geochemical processes that lead to their mobilization. So just to wrap up, what have we learned? It's only been a couple of years since we've started on this project. And my talk was entitled Thawing Permafrost as an Underappreciated Risk to Northern Groundwater Security. And so I think we've learned that it is a more appreciated risk through these sorts of communications and the results that we're seeing. And I haven't gotten into the chemical details of this, but really what we're getting at is what are the chemical processes and the hydrological processes that control water quality during the thaw of permafrost? And there's geologic controls. I don't want to scare everyone into saying these sorts of results would be applicable to any permafrost across the global north. That's something that we need to work on by collecting more data. But there are certain geological conditions where we're more likely to get problematic water quality. And these results really inform water supply management. So if you're a community looking to supply new water source for your town, if you're an industrial operator and you need to do some sort of modification to the landscape, the results that we're producing are helpful in designing your operation so that you can mitigate water quality issues. And the last point is that our work has really closely involved northern partners. And that's been really huge because we've had a lot of dialogue with local partners, and that's informed us as to what are some of the local concerns that we should be studying. And at the same time, we've had a lot of outreach and communications where they're also being made aware of issues that they might not have considered a few years ago. So I think we've come a long way there, and there's a long way to go yet. Thank you.
You can see how we make up for lousy pictures of groundwater with these beautiful terrain pictures, eh? You just want to work in groundwater when you see all that? So now magic happens behind us in a room somewhere out there, and we get a feed from Zoom. So let's see how that will work here. Here we go. Sarah, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the event. Wish you were here in person, but thanks for joining us. And you're all set.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be joining you here from Treaty 3 territory today. Thank you for having me. I'm Sarah Dixon Anderson. I am a professor of civil engineering at McMaster University, and I'm also a hydrogeologist. So I'll be speaking today about our project towards Saskatchewan well water security, knowledge and tools for people and livestock health. I'd like to start off by acknowledging my co-PI on this project, Corinne Schuster-Wellis, who is there with you in person, as well as we know the graduate students who carry a large burden of the load, the majority burden. Ahmed Okasha, who is a PhD student at McMaster, Alana Santos, who is a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan, and Hafsa Momin was an undergraduate thesis student here at McMaster as well. So let's just start off by talking about private wells for a moment. About 12% of Canadians, or 4.6 million people, use private wells for at least a portion of their drinking water supply. And the challenge is that private wells lie outside of regulatory oversight. So it can make things like source water protection particularly challenging. But it also leaves private well owners and users on their own when it comes to things like deciding if they need treatment and what sort of treatment they might need, and how to maintain their wells. So this really does put private well users at risk of waterborne illnesses. Let's just take a minute to look at this cartoon, and we can talk about some of the systems that are important in this context. So starting with land use and land cover, different types of contaminants can arise from different land uses, and land use and land cover can also impact the loading of those contaminants. Precipitation will drive contaminants through the environment, so weather is important and seasonality is also important. The characteristics of the subsurface system are important in several contexts. So they will help dictate how long it will take for a contaminant in the subsurface to reach a well, and whether a contaminant may be attenuated or retained in the subsurface system before reaching the well. And also some subsurface environments have some naturally occurring contaminants, which we just heard about. So in Saskatchewan in particular, arsenic can be a problem. And then humans, and we can't always have to remember that humans are a critically important part of the system. So their stewardship behavior can help prevent contamination from occurring in their wells. So, for example, knowing where on a property fertilizer could safely be applied, and how and when to conduct well maintenance. Conducting regular testing can keep well users informed about their water quality. And also what sorts of treatments can be applied if well water quality is compromised, so they can help them protect their health. So lots of moving parts and important systems that interact here. So our project in Saskatchewan was really born out of one that we started in Ontario, in which we amalgamated two large databases, the Ontario Water Well Information System and the Water Well Testing Database. And so the Water Well Testing Database contains tests from private well users, and we took the data from January 2010 through December 2017, so 8 years of data. And in the end, we had a large data set with close to 1 million records and close to 160,000 unique wells, with a number of observations, an average of 11 for each. And we use this database along with machine learning techniques with the goal of understanding the drivers of and relationships between climate, well and aquifer characteristics, and E. coli presence in wells. So we brought the Ontario project into our GWF project, but we significantly broadened the objectives to include the social system, so those humans that I said we have to remember. We also included both human health and livestock health. That's also important in Saskatchewan in particular, and some water quality parameters that are of particular concern in Saskatchewan, so metals and nutrients. So you'll see here our objective one really focuses on the social system, understanding the knowledge, perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of private well users. To achieve this, we conducted an online survey of private well users in Saskatchewan. We did this in partnership with our collaborator, the Water Security Agency, and we obtained nearly 200 responses, so quite a bit of feedback. Objective 2 really focuses on the physical system. So this objective has required a substantial effort in digitizing data to create a large data set. So there's a lot of water quality data, as well as many e-logs. So that's still a work in progress. I think that's going to be a long time, but the Water Security Agency will appreciate this digitized data set, I think, when we get through it. And then our third objective really is to bring the physical and social systems together to understand the relative importance of these as they impact local well water security. The long-term vision of our project really is to bring data into action. So to develop a tool or an app for private well users that can help them steward their wells. There could be many functionalities to this app. So for example, we can think about well stewardship education. So how do you conduct well maintenance? What should be done? What are the best practices for testing? What are the implications of various test results that could be returned? The app could provide reminders for testing with instructions for drop-off locations and hours. And it could also alert you to any risks of contamination. So for example, if there's flooding somewhere nearby or particular weather patterns that are of risk. So Ahmed and Alana have a poster at this session, and I'm trying to keep to my 8 minutes, so I'm not going to provide a lot of results. What I want to do here is just give you a little taste of some of the results that have come out of the Ontario side of the project and encourage you to go see Ahmed and Alana's poster. So this first graph shows the total number of water quality tests conducted per well as a function of the first test result that's returned to the well user. So the squares show that there's no significant evidence of contamination. Circles are no results at all. Diamonds, the water may be unsafe, and triangles, the water is unsafe to drink. And I think the really interesting thing here is that when the first result returned to the well user is that there's no evidence of contamination, subsequent testing results significantly drop off much more quickly than if a user is returned a result of a well may be unsafe. So this is definitely a behavior that education could help to change. On the right is another graph. We used a random forest here to analyze or explore adverse E. coli observations in private wells based on the antecedent weather conditions from day N all the way back to day N minus 60. So the top figure shows the ranking order of antecedent days, where the lower ranks represent the more important variables. And you'll see days, up to about day 9, those antecedent days are important. And this actually is reflected in the lower figure where we see the change in accuracy in our model. And again, beyond day 9 or 10, we're really getting diminishing returns in the accuracy of our model. So I'll leave it there and just wanted to acknowledge the Roy Romanov Provincial Lab that has been doing quite a bit of water quality testing for us, as well as Katie White, who is the PhD student on the Ontario project and has really helped us with getting the Saskatchewan one going. So I think I can stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks for taking the time to join us. On top of everything else, Sarah is Associate Dean of Engineering, so she's not allowed to leave very frequently. But she got to us this way, so thanks very much. So since our session started a little late, we'll forego the question period at the end as we're keeping you from your well-deserved coffee break. And if you have questions for our speakers, they're around. And please go and visit the posters. The students really, really appreciate a visit. So thanks for your patience this morning and hope you enjoyed the session.